Yes, good afternoon. This is July 26, 2019. This is wildlife biologist Eric Orff with New Hampshire Fish and Wildlife YouTube channel. And today I want to talk about coyotes, commonly called coy dogs here in New Hampshire. So let's talk about the coyotes, a little bit of historical perspective. Here in this book, The History of New Hampshire Game and Fur Bearers by Helen Silvers, there's only one mention. This book was published in the late 50s, almost 1960. It says here, the coyote was not originally present in the state, and a single specimen is known to have been taken here. This was shot in the town of Holderness on October 24th, 1944, by a fox hunter and identified by wildlife biologist Herbert Siegler, chief of the game division. So, no coyotes historically, but I can tell you, when I went to UNH in the fall of '68, by the next year, 1969, we all had projects that we worked on. And one of the projects that I worked on over the winter of 1969 was to help examine maybe 8 or 10 or maybe a dozen, I think less than a dozen, around 10 coyote carcasses that had been collected over the previous several years by the New Hampshire Fish and Game Department. So they had been sent down to the university to be examined. And that we did. We weighed them, measured them. In fact, there was an article written in the UNH magazine about doing that with Professor Clark. In fact, I tried to look for the picture today. There's actually a picture of me, much younger, smaller me, holding up this coyote as we were examining them. So yes, 8 or 10 coyotes had been collected over a several year period and were sent to the university, and I was lucky enough to be one of the handful of students. There were only 6 of us in the wildlife management curriculum at the time. So we examined those 8 or 10 coyotes. Well, I have mentioned that the New Hampshire trappers, and there were about, well, back then they were close to 1,000, now around 500 or 600. Well, each licensed trapper is required to provide an annual report of what they take by town. And I became the fur bearer biologist around 1980, but the careful records were going back to 1970, where each year we would actually write down in each town the number of coyotes taken, the number of beaver taken. So in each block of town we would accumulate from the trapper's report the total take by town and write it on a map. And what the map shows for coyotes, and I hope I'll come a little closer. So in about 1972, coyotes showed up here in Colebrook, way up on the northwestern side of New Hampshire. Over the next decade, the coyotes, based on these trapping records, swept down the Connecticut River Valley and west. So in about a decade, New Hampshire had coyotes from Colebrook to Seabrook. Maybe a little over that, but by the 80s, I was keeping these records. There was a shadow for a few years right here on the east side of Winnipesaukee, the towns of Alton and New Durham, because the lake kind of blocked that migration eastward. So this area of the state was kind of the last area to actually get coyotes by maybe the mid to late 1980s. But coyotes now and have been since the late 80s or early 90s statewide. The population goes up and down based on how hard the winter is. I mean, typically a tough winter, 60% of the pups born the previous spring will be killed off in the wintertime. As I mentioned when I opened, coyotes have commonly been called coy dogs here. I think part of that is actually relating back to the Fish and Game Department, because I think in the early 60s, the department got 1 or 2 coyotes live somehow, and they actually put them in a pen and they bred them with German Shepherds. Now, when I was a fur bearer biologist, there were files with clippings from newspapers going back into the early 60s where Fish and Game biologist Helen Silvers had put coyotes into a pen and actually crossbred them with dogs. So I think that's actually probably where the term coy dog originated, my best estimation. But you know, during my career as a fur bearer biologist from 1980 about until I retired in 2007, I actually sent coyote tissue samples out, numbers of samples, I think twice, to be examined. Once was out to California, I think UCLA, and another time I think to Virginia, as I recall, to examine the DNA of numbers of coyotes that have been trapped those years. I would say that I did that in the 1990s, so a while ago. You know, none of the coyote tissue samples that I sent to 2 different places had any dog genes, none. What they did have were wolf genes in varying amounts. So we really should be talking about a coy wolf, not a coy dog. You know, most of the coyotes that we weighed around 25 pounds or less, 25, 30 pounds. A big one maybe 40 or 50 pounds, a huge one. A wolf is twice that, 100 pounds. So, and people often mistake our coyotes for wolves. Again, it's another animal, kind of like the fisher, that has a lot of folklore, a lot of myths, a lot of misinformation. And one that's often thought about is, well, coyotes, geez, they've wiped out New Hampshire's deer. You know, coyotes came in and they ate all of our deer, and the poor deer herd is suffering. Well, in 1980, around then, the Fish and Game Department estimated we had about 40,000 deer. That's when we had, in 1980, 83, we probably had, a couple hundred coyotes at most. But guess what? There's probably 4 or 5 coyotes now. They're statewide, and the population, varies by a few thousand, probably a couple thousand from year to year. And guess what? We have 120,000 deer. We have 3 times as many deer now as when there were no coyotes. How has the coyote killed off the deer population? Yes, I certainly think it impacts some areas, probably the White Mountains where the habitat is poor. Maine did a study some years ago where they had radio-collared coyotes, and certainly some of the coyotes, in June when they're weaning their pups, 75% of the diet of the pups were fawns. Yeah, we've got a lot of fawns. Coyotes catch and eat whatever is easiest to catch, and in June it's deer. But this time of year they're also eating berries, blueberries, raspberries. When we examine the contents of coyotes back there in the 60s, mostly mice. Some deer tissue, probably more likely, certainly from roadkills or dead deer. They certainly clean up any dead deer that they find. Do they kill live deer? Absolutely. Anytime they can catch a deer, they will. And they, as I said, they eat a lot of fawns during the early spring. But the fact is, they really haven't impacted our deer herd. We have 3 times as many deer now, where we have several thousand coyotes, as to when we didn't have any coyotes. So they can't be a big factor in my mind as a wildlife biologist. I kind of respect them. Trappers take the majority of those that are taken. Again, looking at the 2018 Wildlife Harvest Report put out by the New Hampshire Fish and Game Department, and it hasn't changed a lot. Again, I was the fur bearer biologist, so I regulated trapping and hunting of these species for about 30 years. In 2010, the fall and winter of 2010-11, 412 coyotes were taken. 2013, 499. 2012, 534. So generally between 400 and 500 coyotes are taken by trappers each year. Back in the 80s, we were actually, our conservation officers, who we work closely with, were sealing fur bearers. They had to put before you could legally sell or even transfer the pelt to somebody else, you had to have it sealed by a conservation officer. And we were having them seal a lot of different animals back in the 80s, including coyotes. Well, you know what? The number of coyotes taken by hunters back then, as I recall, was 50 or fewer. So yeah, there's some coyotes that are probably taken over the summertime by somebody that shoots some, and the fur has no value, so they didn't get them sealed. But hunters take very few coyotes, probably fewer than 100 a year in New Hampshire. So the majority of coyotes, and there's probably a population of 4,000 or 5,000, so the majority of them by far are taken by trappers. They are common throughout the state. It's a dominant female and her young and her mate, and 3 to 5 young are born each year typically. And as I said, depending on the winter, not so much on trappers, but depending on the winter, a lot may survive or may not survive. So they're largely driven, like a deer herd, by winter conditions over hunters or trappers. So here's an animal that has been demonized, and I like most wildlife. I am very lucky to have worked with many of these, but coyotes, they certainly have a place in the state. They are not coy dogs. There is no dog DNA. There is wolf DNA. They are common virtually in every town in New Hampshire. You certainly hear them. They're the canids. They're vocal, and I've heard them here at my home over the years, off and on. But this time of year, as the farmers are mowing their fields, you might see a coyote out in the field. We had a roadkill of a young one I noticed on the road on Route 28 right here in town yesterday. So they are out and about moving. But so coyotes, kind of a mysterious animal in New Hampshire, one that has struck fear in many people. But hey, they mostly eat mice and a lot of vegetation. Will they eat a deer? If they can catch a deer, but most deer they cannot. So they have probably not a significant impact on the deer population here in New Hampshire, nor on any other population. They mostly eat small mammals, mostly mice and vegetation. So they just are woven into the fabric of New Hampshire, and I certainly respect them. I hope you do too.